Welcome to Juan's World. I'm not going to tell you anymore which episode this is. You'll find it out in the introduction. And it's nice to know that we're now on episode such and so, but it's getting a little bit tiresome for me to be keeping track of which episode it is. Rather, what I'll tell you is that this episode is going to be about trust. Now, I have been talking about opposites and oppositions, and I'm going to continue that, but there's a reason why I'm going to stop now and talk about trust, because it has to do with authority, sources, information, all kinds of things that are actually really current right now. And this is why. I started writing a chapter in my new book called Opposites, and the chapter was going to be about what opposites are and why they're important. And I don't normally go to a dictionary when I'm thinking about the meaning of a word, for good reason. And my students always used to go to dictionaries when they wanted to find out the meaning of a word. And I always used to say, don't do that. Especially don't do that in my class, because when I'm talking about some subject in anthropology, my information comes from anthropological sources, and it's more detailed, more in-depth, more significant in a lot of ways, culturally and intellectually, than a simple dictionary entry. A dictionary entry is a very brief pointer in a direction, and you need more than that when you're studying in my class, so don't do it. However, in this case, I looked up the dictionary definition of opposite in the Oxford English Dictionary, 2nd edition, which I have access to online, which is really convenient. And so I'm going to start right there talking about the authority of dictionaries. And then I'm going to move into a more general discussion of who you can trust when it comes to information. Because we're living in a world of disinformation, misinformation, and just plain lies. It's just routine. The Trump administration is just full of lies. The Brexit, Boris Johnson and all his crew, full of lies. Propaganda is everywhere. And so I'm going to ask the much more general but significant question: who can you trust? Well, let's get going. I've used the Oxford English Dictionary for research for many years. I first started using it back in the 1970s when I was an undergraduate, and I continued using it in my graduate studies. Back in those days, various book clubs had a special offer. You could get the complete first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary in miniature form, and it came in a special case with a magnifying glass. And there it is. You could sit it on your desk and look up any word you wanted and it gave you not only all the definitions, all the spellings, the etymology, but most importantly, the Oxford English Dictionary is an historical dictionary. So I want to make a distinction here between a descriptive dictionary and a prescriptive dictionary. And that distinction, descriptive versus prescriptive, can apply in a lot of areas apart from just dictionaries. But we'll stick with dictionaries for a moment. Descriptive means this is how a word was used. It is a description of how people used the word. Prescriptive dictionaries tell you how you should use a word. And so there are two different purposes to the dictionaries. A prescriptive dictionary is going to be used by a publisher, for example, to help guide authors. You know, they'll use a word and the editor will say, no, you can't use the word that way because the dictionary that we're using tells you you should use it this way. Well, I'm not interested in prescriptive dictionaries, certainly not in this case. I'm interested in how people have used words over time. And so I began with opposite. Very, very interesting. It's not a particularly old word in English. It only comes from around 1435. Geoffrey Chaucer in The Knight's Tale is the first example that people have found of the word opposite in English. 1435. So, and then it goes on, and I've found out that through the 15th century, various meanings were added. The first meaning of opposite was simply like across from. Like I say, my house is opposite the shops, or my desk is opposite the window. It was first used for position, and then later it was used for contrary. You know, that is the opposite point of view. And the etymology tells you it comes from Latin, it comes from opponere, which means to put against, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now, all of that is fascinating to me because that's the way my brain works, and that chapter is moving right along. I'm developing a very strong sense of that chapter and some of the ideas. I don't have the whole book worked out yet, unfortunately. I probably should do a little more thinking in that regard. But I do have a grasp of how the word opposite has been used in English. And what I'm going to have to do subsequently is figure out what opposite is in other languages and in other cultures. Is the concept of opposite universal? I'm kind of thinking it is, and kind of thinking that maybe it isn't, because when I look at writers like Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, and it gives us the, not exactly definition, but idea about yin and yang, and about opposites. His idea of opposites is really, really different from what I'm used to. And I really kind of like it. What he says, among other things, is that opposites help define one another. He says, for example, you know what short is once you know what tall is. Well, that's only one kind of opposite. The one that he particularly stresses is good and evil, and he says if you don't work out what evil is, and then you won't have to worry about what it is or worry about what good and evil are. Just don't define them at all. So there's a whole slew of things there that I'm going to get to eventually, but for right now I want to talk about trust. Like, who do you trust? Well, I trust the Oxford English Dictionary because it doesn't just give me a definition that I can read off and say, oh yeah, that's what opposite means. It gives me the usage. So I have sources and they are called primary sources. But there's still a problem, because the Oxford English Dictionary does not, of course, give every single example of the use of a word. It gives periodic uses and what it considers to be best usage. All right, well, who decides what's best usage?
Now, as it happens, I know the former general editor of the third edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, John Widdowson. He's retired, so he's not the editor anymore, but I've known him for many, many years because he used me as a reader and as a source for entries in the third edition. So one of the answers to who is an authority, who can you trust when it comes to the usage of a word, well, one of the answers is me. Well, I don't know whether you can trust me or not, but the people who read and produce entries for the Oxford English Dictionary are people like me. And we choose entries from books that we trust. Now think about this for a minute. We're using books. Books are published. What about the usage of words by millions upon millions of English speakers who never wrote a book? Probably many of them never even read a book. Is their usage of words irrelevant because they are not educated, because they're not writers? Well, that's a good question. So we're getting down to the nitty-gritty straight away. That is, what counts as an authority, or who counts as an authority? Who can you trust? Well, this all sort of came to a head for me recently because I'm in the habit, when I'm not writing, of just kind of noodling around the internet, and I get on YouTube quite a lot, and I find different videos to watch. And there are certain channels that I watch more than others, even though they are intensely annoying. For example, Top Tens is one that I used to watch a lot. The Bright Side, TED Talks, Mojo, there's a lot of them. They're very well produced, very sophisticated, and when you start watching them you think, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that. Oh, so Richard III was not a bad guy after all. He was really a good guy. It was just that Shakespeare wrote a play that made him into a bad guy, and blah 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 blah. If you're not careful, you can believe what you're told because the channel is a sophisticated channel, and the person who's dispensing the information appears to be very smart and well-spoken and secure, and you think, oh, well, of course, that must be true then. This is on the internet, it must be true. I mean, everyone knows that just because it's on the internet, it's not true at all. But what you don't realize is that gobs and gobs and gobs of stuff that are on these channels that I've mentioned, I'll mention them again: Top Tens, Mojo, TED Talks, Bright Side. I have watched them quite consistently for the past, let's say, year, maybe not quite that much, but because I got sick of them. They are full of errors. They're riddled with mistakes, and they're not updated or challenged. And so people watch them and they say, okay, well, I saw this on Mojo, or I saw it on Top Tens, must be true. How do you know whether something is true or not? Well, I have two recourses. One
is to go to the primary sources, to go to the documents that are original, so that if, for example, I'm interested in, I don't know, let's say Richard III, then go and look at the documents that were produced in his historic period. Look at the archaeology. I mean, I know, for example, that his body was exhumed kind of accidentally. I guess it was found in a parking lot, and it was exhumed at one point, and various things were discovered about him, about his back. Did he have a hunchback? We can also look at what he wrote, what his contemporaries wrote, and so on and so forth. Those are primary sources. They will help to confirm or disconfirm information in the historical record. That's how I can trust. The other way that I can determine whether somebody giving a TED talk or a Mojo talk is telling the truth or not, apart from the fact of my own knowledge, which, you know, is fairly comprehensive, and primary sources, which I can always look up. The other test is simply a test of rationality. Does this make any sense? And I have to say that I have been listening to talks recently, and I have just thought, this makes no sense. For example, simple example. I watched a TED talk the other day about love, and the speaker was a professor of philosophy, and so you'd think, okay, I can trust this guy. He's a professor. He's got a PhD. Not necessarily good credentials. I've got a PhD. I wouldn't trust me. But anyway, all right. So the guy is a professor, got a PhD. Let's hear him speak. And he gets up and he says, now I want to tell you about romantic love. You might think that romantic love has been around for a long time, but it's only been around since, at the best, the 18th century, during the period of the Romantics. And that's where we get the word romantic and romantic love. It comes from the Romantics. And then you start thinking about who are the Romantics, you know, people like Byron and Keats and Shelley and so forth. And you think about their passionate involvement in nature and blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now I'm sitting listening to this guy, and he's saying the whole idea of romantic love was generated out of the Romantic era, and that before that people got married and, I guess, had sex or whatever, for convenience or for lust, if you like, but not for romantic love. That this is something that evolved in Europe in the 18th and then down into the 19th century and down to the present day. And I just look at the screen and I want to shout, Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is a classic story of romantic love. Tristan and Isolde. Lancelot and Guinevere. We can think about couples throughout history who are exemplars of romantic love. Now, all right, you can say, well, there's different kinds of romantic love. There's the medieval chivalric kind. There's Shakespeare's idea. But Shakespeare's idea of love looks pretty much like mine. Like, read his sonnets. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Love is not love that alters when it alteration finds. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, Shakespeare's idea of love doesn't look very different from my idea of love. This idea that somehow or other romantic love was created in the Romantic period is just absolute nonsense. And yet, this professor with a PhD with a big audience and with the TED Talk on YouTube, an even bigger audience, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, is dispensing rubbish, nonsense. But who's going to challenge that person? Well, me, of course, but my YouTube channel has like 11 followers because I'm not interested in becoming a big shot. And here is the problem. That people build careers and on ambition and on fame and the number of people on their channel or number of people that they have following their tweets or whatever. That's not a good criterion of truth. I've got a lot of followers, so I must be saying something true. That is just leading you down the garden path. All right, I'm going to conclude this part with some images rather than my unshaven, smiling face, just to give you a bit of variety. But I'm going to ask you again the most important question for now: who can you trust? And part of the answer is, don't trust me. Don't trust anybody. Always support the information that you're given with additional information, additional sources. Most importantly, what I want to say is that in every endeavor, when you're watching YouTube, when you're just listening to a friend, when you're listening to a lecture, whatever the case, always ask critical questions. Is this true? How can I support this statement? I'm not going to accept anything on face value. I am going to be a critical listener. I'm going to be a critical thinker. When I read a book, I'm not just going to say, oh, okay, the book says this, so it must be true. When I watch a television show, when I watch an internet program, when I watch anything, think of it as always dispensing propaganda. Everything is a form of propaganda. So your job is to ask the deep question: is this statement true, and how do I determine whether it's true or not? If you like what I'm saying, then like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.